She was just the girl who poured the water. Invisible, silent, nobody, or so they thought. The night the Wolf of Palermo walked into Maison Corbeau, the air in the French Quarter turned heavy as an August storm about to break. Men who'd killed without hesitation sat straighter in their chairs, smoothing ties that suddenly felt too tight. Conversations dropped to whispers. Even the cicadas outside seemed to quiet their song. Before we continue, like this video if you've ever felt invisible in a world that only sees credentials and titles. Share it with someone who needs to hear that courage doesn't require permission. And subscribe so you don't miss what happens when one temp worker sees the truth everyone else is paid to ignore. Now let's continue. But when the ash-blonde waitress approached the private terrace table, she didn't stumble or stammer. She moved with that same quiet precision she always had. The kind of grace that made people forget she was there the moment she stepped away. Invisible by design, safe through silence. Until she overheard the old man speak of honoring the dead. 5 words slipped from her lips in a dialect that hadn't been spoken outside oath-binding ceremonies since 1984. Words she didn't consciously remember learning. Words that had been drilled into muscle memory during a childhood year that official records claimed never existed. The room didn't explode with violence. It froze with recognition. Because those weren't just words in an archaic Sicilian dialect. They were a ceremonial response. The second half of a blood promise spoken only during oath-binding nights when men swore their lives, their families, their futures on sacred ground. Words never meant for outsiders. Never meant for servants. And certainly never ever meant for women. Yet she had spoken them perfectly. With the exact cadence, the proper rhythm, the ceremonial weight that transformed language into law. The most dangerous man in America, a patriarch who'd built 40 years of reputation on honor, respect and keeping his word, looked at her as if she'd risen from a grave he'd forgotten he'd dug. His olive wood cane clattered against the terrace tile. His face, weathered by decades of command, went pale as ash. Because he recognized those words, he knew what they meant, and he understood, in that single frozen moment, that the oath he'd broken 4 decades ago hadn't died with the men who'd witnessed it. It had been waiting, patient, inevitable, carried by a woman who didn't even know she was a weapon. This is the story of Briar Calhoun. The waitress who discovered she'd been carrying unfinished business beneath her apron her entire life. A blood promise spoken by ghosts, delivered by someone who shouldn't exist, demanding an accounting from a man who thought he'd buried his sins deep enough that they'd never surface. She thought she was nobody. She was wrong. And in New Orleans, where history doesn't die but waits in the humidity, in the brick, in the words people speak without knowing why they remember them, the past had finally come to collect what it was owed, not with violence. With 5 perfect words in a language older than empires. And the Wolf of Palermo, who'd faced down assassins and federal prosecutors and rival families without flinching, heard those words, and understood he was facing something far more dangerous than any gun. He was facing the truth. Chapter 1. The dinner service at Maison Corbeau was less a performance, and more a carefully choreographed ritual of disappearing. In the heart of New Orleans' French Quarter, the restaurant occupied a historic Creole mansion that had survived hurricanes, floods, and 2 centuries of secrets whispered between its exposed brick walls. Gas lamps cast amber light across cypress wood floors, worn smooth by generations of feet. Wrought iron railings curled like frozen smoke along the second-floor balcony overlooking the main dining room. It was the kind of place where a bottle of wine cost more than most people's monthly rent, and the clientele spoke in 7 languages about things that would collapse governments if spoken too loudly. During the annual offshore shipping conference, Maison Corbeau served another purpose entirely. It became neutral ground, the one place in the city where international crime figures could negotiate without bloodshed, where territories were divided over duck confit and agreements sealed with vintage Bordeaux instead of bullets. Briar Calhoun moved through this world like a ghost. Tall and slim with sharp cheekbones that gave her face an almost severe elegance, she kept her ash-blonde hair braided tightly and pinned low against her neck. Functional, not stylish. Her steel-gray eyes rarely met anyone's gaze directly, staying focused on the work, the table, the next task. She wore the same plain black uniform as the other servers, but her sleeves were always rolled to the exact same point on her forearms, a precision that seemed unconscious but absolute. Around her neck, hidden beneath her collar, hung a thin silver ring on a delicate chain. She never removed it, never explained it. Most people never noticed it was there. For 2 years, Briar had perfected the art of invisibility at Maison Corbeau. She'd learned that survival meant not being seen. If you were silent, you were safe. If you didn't exist in their memories, you couldn't be hurt. She moved with quiet precision through the dining room, anticipating needs before they were spoken, refilling water glasses before they emptied, clearing plates with movements so smooth they barely registered. Like someone trained to stay alert without appearing vigilant. She didn't question why she moved this way. Didn't wonder why her hands knew to check exits automatically. Why her peripheral vision tracked movement in doorways. Why she positioned herself with her back never fully to a room. These were just habits. Reflexes from a childhood she barely remembered, and a foster care system that had taught her to be small, quiet, forgettable. Tonight though, the air in Maison Corbeau felt different. The maitre d', Anton, a fastidious man in his 60s, who normally radiated calm authority, was practically vibrating with nervous energy. He'd been checking the reservation list every 15 minutes since 3 p.m., adjusting place settings that didn't need adjusting, polishing already gleaming silverware. In the kitchen, Chef Etienne, a temperamental Frenchman who usually expressed his artistic vision by throwing plates when sous chefs disappointed him, was personally wiping down counters himself. His hands, steady enough to fillet a fish blindfolded, trembled slightly as he inspected each dish before it left the pass. Briar refilled water carafes at the service station, trying to ignore the prickle of unease at the base of her neck. Something was wrong. Or not wrong exactly. Just different, significant. Big party coming in, Marcel, one of the sous chefs, whispered as he passed with a tray of oysters. Private dining. The whole upstairs terrace cleared. Who is it? Briar asked, keeping her voice low. A senator? Marcel shook his head, eyes wide. Bigger, the veils. The glass carafe in Briar's hand didn't slip, but her fingers tightened fractionally around the handle. Veil. The name triggered something. Not quite a memory, more like the ghost of a memory. A fragment that dissolved before she could grasp it. White hair. An olive wood cane. Someone's voice saying remember the words. But then it was gone, leaving only the faint unease that she'd forgotten something important. They say the wolf is finally retiring, Marcel continued, loading his tray. Whole upstairs cleared. Owner himself called. No exceptions. The Wolf of Palermo. Briar had heard the name whispered in the neutral ground nights, always with a particular tone. Not quite fear, but something close to it. Respect weighted with wariness. She didn't know why the name made her chest feel tight. Anton appeared at her elbow, making her jump. Calhoun, upstairs terrace. VIP service. Yes, sir. And Calhoun. Anton's voice dropped lower. You're invisible tonight. That's a compliment, not an insult. Understand? She nodded. Being invisible was what she did best. The cypress doors to the street opened at exactly 7 p.m., and the humidity rushed in, along with the scent of approaching rain. The temperature in the dining room seemed to drop despite the August heat. Security came first. 3 men in dark suits, broad-shouldered with shaved heads and broken noses, moving with the kind of calm that came from absolute confidence and violence. They scanned the room with dead eyes, positioned themselves at strategic points, one near the kitchen entrance, one by the front door, one at the base of the stairs. Leading them was a man Briar recognized from previous neutral ground nights, Lyndon Crow, head of private security, former federal contractor, the kind of man who always stood exactly where exits intersected, broad shoulders, shaved head, a nose that had been broken at least twice. He had a way of standing perfectly still that made him more noticeable, not less, like a predator that didn't need to move to be threatening. Then Rowan Vale entered, mid-30s, with dark auburn hair styled with expensive precision. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Briar made in 6 months, and a minimalist watch that somehow communicated both wealth and restraint. He moved like someone who'd never questioned his right to own any room he entered, calm, observant, emotionally controlled. He looked more like a private equity executive than anything else. The dining room took notice of Rowan Vale, but it didn't freeze. It froze for the man who walked in behind him. Eldrick Vale was a study in old world authority that refused to Americanize even after 40 years stateside. Late 70s, with a lean, almost fragile frame that somehow commanded more presence than younger, stronger men. His white hair was slicked straight back from a face that looked like a ledger of debts paid and promises broken, deep lines, sharp angles, eyes that had seen empires rise and fall and remained unimpressed by both. He walked with a cane carved from olive wood, leaning on it not for show but from genuine necessity. He wore a linen suit despite the heat, perfectly pressed, with a silk pocket square the color of old wine. European tailoring. Italian shoes that had probably been handmade in Sicily 50 years ago. He looked like a relic from a different time, a time when blood oaths meant more than contracts, and a man's word could build or destroy kingdoms. Silence swept through Maison Corbeau like a physical thing. Forks paused mid-air. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the sound of the ceiling fans seemed to quiet. Anton practically bowed as he approached. Mr. Vale, Mr. Vale. It is an honor, gentlemen. Rowan raised one hand, the gesture cutting through Anton's nervous greeting with corporate efficiency. The terrace. Now. Private. Of course. This way immediately, please. The procession moved toward the stairs. Security first, then Rowan and his associates, then Eldrick moving with careful, measured steps. Briar stood at the end of the service line with the other staff, head down, eyes on the polished floor. Don't be seen. Don't be noticed. Don't exist. They passed within 3 feet of her. She could smell cigar smoke, aged leather, something herbal, rosemary maybe, or sage. Old world scents that triggered that same elusive fragment of memory. White hair, olive wood. Remember the words. Then they were past, moving up the curved staircase to the private terrace. Anton appeared beside her, voice tight. Calhoun, you're on the terrace tonight. Yes, sir. Discreet. Invisible. Perfect. Yes, sir. As she gathered her tray and prepared to head upstairs, Briar caught Lyndon Crow's eyes on her. Not threatening. Just assessing. Like he was filing her away, under, quote, variables to monitor. She looked down immediately, heart beating faster than it should, because for the first time in 2 years of being invisible, someone had actually seen her, and she didn't know if that was about to save her life, or end it. Chapter 2. The private terrace overlooked the French Quarter rooftops like a secret perched above the city. Gas lamps flickered in their iron brackets, casting shadows that danced with the slow rotation of the ceiling fans. The air was thick with humidity, and the scent of night-blooming jasmine climbing the wrought iron railings. The table was set for 8, with the kind of precision that communicated respect without servility. White linen, crystal that caught the lamplight, silverware placed with geometric exactness. Eldrick Vale sat at the head, his olive wood cane resting against the arm of his chair. Rowan to his right, perfectly postured, already reviewing something on his phone before the first course arrived. 5 associates filled the remaining seats, a mix of older Sicilian men with weathered faces and younger American operators in expensive suits. Lyndon Crow didn't sit. He stood where the terrace stairs met the interior hallway, positioned so he could see both the table and the street below through the gaps in the balustrade. His stance was relaxed but ready, hands clasped in front of him, eyes constantly moving. Briar served the first course with the same quiet precision she'd perfected over 2 years. Cold cucumber soup with lump crab, microgreens, a thread of lemon oil. She moved like a shadow, present when needed, invisible when not. Her hands knew the rhythm without conscious thought. Right side service, never reach across, anticipate the next need before it's spoken. The conversation flowed in 3 languages, shifting seamlessly between English, Italian, and Sicilian, depending on who was speaking and what was being discussed. Rowan dominated the early dialogue, his voice carrying the flat confidence of someone used to being heard. The containerized shipping routes through Port of Los Angeles are expanding. Union negotiations are concluding favorably. We'll have preferential dock access by 4th quarter. One of the associates, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, responded in Italian. And the customs inspections? Managed, Rowan replied in English, the code switching deliberate. We've established relationships with the appropriate oversight positions. Another associate mentioned labor disputes in Long Beach. Someone else brought up infrastructure costs. Throughout it all, Eldrick Vale remained quiet, watching, listening, sipping wine with slow deliberation. His dark eyes moved from speaker to speaker, but his expression gave nothing away. He looked like a man attending his own wake, present but already halfway gone, observing the world he was leaving behind with the detachment of someone who'd made peace with endings. Briar refilled water glasses, moving counterclockwise around the table. She'd learned to anticipate when glasses were approaching empty, to pour before anyone had to ask. Her hands moved automatically, efficiently, without drawing attention. She was refilling the glass at the far end of the table when Eldrick spoke. Not to the table, not to anyone in particular. Just spoke. In archaic Sicilian, the words carrying the cadence of a proverb, a lament, something remembered from another time. Gli uomini che non onorano i morti non meritano di essere ricordati. Men who don't honor the dead don't deserve to be remembered. It was a private observation, a commentary on something, or someone, not present. The kind of thing old men said to themselves when they were thinking about legacy, about the promises they'd kept, and the ones they'd broken. The phrase hit Briar like a physical blow. Her hands stopped mid-pour, water frozen halfway to the glass. Her mouth opened before conscious thought could intervene. And in the same archaic Sicilian, with perfect ceremonial cadence, the words fell from her lips, like they'd been waiting 20 years to be spoken. E I figli che dimenticano I giuramenti dei padri portano il peso dei tradimenti. And the sons who forget the father's oaths carry the weight of betrayals. It wasn't aggressive, wasn't challenging. It was ceremonial. A call and response from oath-binding knights, when men swore their lives and futures on sacred ground. The second half of a ritual phrase, spoken only during blood promises, when witnesses were present, and oaths were sealed with wine and bread, and words older than any living memory. Words never meant for outsiders, never meant for servants, and absolutely categorically never meant for women. Yet she had spoken them perfectly, with the exact rhythm, the proper weight, the ceremonial precision that transformed language into law. The terrace went absolutely silent. Rowan's fork paused halfway to his mouth, suspended in mid-air, his eyes cut to his father, confusion flickering across his usually controlled expression. The associates froze, some mid-sentence, others mid-gesture. One of the older Sicilian men's hand tightened around his wineglass hard enough that Briar heard the crystal creak. Lyndon Crow's hand moved fractionally toward his jacket, the movement so subtle most people wouldn't have noticed. But Briar noticed. Because some part of her, the part that knew how to move through rooms checking exits, the part that knew ceremonial phrases in a dialect she didn't remember learning, noticed everything. Eldrick's cane clattered against the terrace tile. The sound rang out like a gunshot in the silence. His face drained of color, not slowly, but all at once, like someone had opened a valve and let all the blood rush out. His mouth hung slightly open. His hands, weathered and spotted with age, gripped the arms of his chair hard enough that his knuckles went white. He stared at Briar with an expression she couldn't categorize. Not anger, not exactly fear. Horror, recognition, disbelief. Like she'd risen from a grave he'd forgotten he'd dug. Who taught you those words? His voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like broken glass. Briar's mind finally caught up to what her mouth had done. The water pitcher trembled in her hands. She took a step back, suddenly aware of 8 pairs of eyes fixed on her with laser focus. I don't remember. I didn't mean to. I'm sorry, I don't know why I said that. WHO taught you those words. The explosion of volume made her flinch. This wasn't the tired patriarch sipping wine and contemplating retirement. This was something else, something ancient and dangerous and absolutely terrified. Rowan stood, his chair scraping against tile. Papa, sit down. Eldrick didn't look at his son, didn't look away from Briar. Rowan sat. The silence stretched, taut as a wire about to snap. Then Eldrick spoke again, quieter now, but his voice was trembling in a way that made it more frightening than the shouting. The oath. The oath from Caltanissetta, 1984. He looked at Rowan then, and for the first time in his life, Rowan saw something in his father's eyes he'd never seen before. Fear. Pure, undiluted existential fear. The child, Eldrick whispered, still staring at Briar like she was a ghost made flesh. The witness child. The one he couldn't finish. But Briar understood, even though she didn't understand anything at all. She was something Eldrick Vale had thought was dead. Something he'd buried so deep, he'd convinced himself it would never surface. And somehow, she'd just proven him catastrophically wrong. With 5 words in a language she didn't consciously remember speaking. Words that, based on the way Lyndon Crow's hand had moved toward his jacket, and the way the older Sicilian men were looking at her now, half reverence, half terror, were apparently more dangerous than any weapon she could have drawn. She opened her mouth to apologize, to explain, to say something that would make this stop. But Eldrick spoke first, his voice barely audible. She's the child. And Briar realized, with cold certainty settling in her chest like ice water, that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't begin to understand. Because she'd spoken words that weren't supposed to exist, and the Wolf of Palermo was looking at her like she'd just resurrected the one ghost he'd spent 40 years trying to forget. Chapter 3. The dinner continued, but the air on the terrace had changed. Conversations resumed in careful, measured tones, English only now, nothing in Italian or Sicilian, as if the languages themselves had become dangerous. Rowan asked measured questions about logistics. The associates provided measured answers about shipping schedules. Everyone measured their words, their gestures, their breathing. Eldrick said nothing. He sat with his hands folded on the table, staring at the space where Briar had been standing, his wine untouched. Briar was dismissed after the second course. Anton appeared at her elbow with the kind of gentle firmness that communicated this wasn't a request. Calhoun, you're done for the evening. Excellent work. Here. He pressed an envelope into her hand, thick with cash, far more than her usual night's tips. Go home, rest. Her hands were still trembling as she untied her apron in the staff room. The other servers avoided looking at her directly, as if whatever had happened on the terrace might be contagious. She changed quickly, pulling on jeans and a t-shirt, stuffing the envelope into her bag without counting it. She didn't understand what she'd triggered, didn't understand why 5 words in a dialect she didn't remember learning had turned the most dangerous man in America's face, the color of ash. The walk back to her shotgun apartment in Bywater took 20 minutes through humid night air that pressed against her skin like a living thing. Streetlights cast pools of amber on cracked sidewalk. Somewhere a blues guitarist was playing for tourists on Frenchman Street, the notes drifting through the dark like smoke. Her apartment was a single-room shotgun, bedroom, living space, and kitchen, all visible from the front door, railroad style, the kind of place where you could stand at the entrance and see straight through to the back window. Cheap rent, cash paid monthly to a landlord who didn't ask questions. No lease, no paper trail, the way she'd lived for as long as she could remember. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the wall. Men who don't honor the dead don't deserve to be remembered. The phrase echoed in her mind, and with it came a fragment. Barely an image, more like the ghost of a memory. White hair slicked back, an olive wood cane. Not Eldrick's face, but someone else's. Older? Younger? She couldn't tell. And a voice. Woman's voice. Speaking in that same archaic Sicilian. Remember the words, Isabella. When the time comes, you speak the words. Isabella, not Briar. Isabella. The name felt foreign and familiar at the same time, like a dress she'd worn once as a child that no longer fit but still smelled like something she couldn't quite place. She pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to force the memory into focus. But it dissolved like morning fog, leaving only the certainty that something had been taken from her, something important. Meanwhile, in a private room at Maison Corbeau, Lyndon Crow sat with a laptop and a phone, doing what he did best. Gathering information that people thought was hidden. Briar Calhoun's employment file was thin but clean. 2 years at Maison Corbeau. Exemplary performance reviews. Never late. Never called in sick. Never caused problems. The perfect invisible employee. Before Maison Corbeau, a series of service jobs across New Orleans. Café du Monde for 18 months. A hotel in the Garden District for 18 months before that. A catering company before that. Each stint exactly 18 months, give or take a week. Like someone following a schedule, or someone trained to move before patterns became noticeable. Before that, a gap. Employment history went dark, between ages 18 and 21. No W-2s, no tax records, nothing official. Lyndon pulled her social security number, ran it through databases he wasn't supposed to have access to but did anyway. The number had been issued when she was 7 years old, not at birth. 7. Foster care records existed. He found those easily enough. Briar Calhoun entered Louisiana state system at age 6. Bounced between homes until 18. Aged out. Standard story for thousands of kids. Except the records felt wrong. Too clean. Too perfect. Like someone had created a paper trail that would satisfy casual inspection, but wouldn't survive deep scrutiny. He called a contact at a private investigation firm that specialized in reconstructing erased identities. Social security number issued at 7, he said. Foster care records that are almost too complete. What am I looking at? The contact was quiet for a moment. Witness protection? Federal relocation? For a 6-year-old? Then someone with serious resources built her a background. Not Mafia quality. This is intelligence level. Federal? Maybe international. Someone who needed a child to disappear completely but remain functional, legal, employable. Lyndon thanked him and hung up. Someone had invested significant time and expertise in hiding Briar Calhoun. Or whoever she'd been before she became Briar Calhoun. In his hotel suite at the Royal Sonesta, Rowan Vale was doing his own research. Oath-binding ceremonies, Sicilian tradition, blood promises. The search results were sparse. Most of this history existed in oral tradition, not written records. But he found enough. Academic papers about pre-modern Sicilian conflict resolution. Anthropological studies of ritual language. A dissertation from a University of Palermo professor about witnessed children in Mafia truces. The practice dated back centuries, but had largely died out by the 1980s. When families wanted to ensure peace agreements were honored, they'd exchange children, not as hostages exactly, but as living witnesses to the oath. The children would be raised by the other family for a set period, taught ceremonial phrases, trained to embody the promise. If either family broke the oath, the witnessed child could speak the ceremonial response, proof that the promise had been witnessed, that betrayal had occurred, that honor had been violated. The last documented use of witnessed children, mid-1980s, in Sicily, during failed truce negotiations between rival families. Rowan sat back, staring at his laptop screen. His father had been in Sicily in the mid-1980s, building the empire, making alliances, fighting wars, making oaths. At 2 a.m., Eldrick Vale sat alone in his hotel suite, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in rapid Sicilian to someone in Caltanissetta. The conversation was brief, tense. When the voice on the other end answered his question, Eldrick's hand started shaking so badly he nearly dropped the phone. "We thought you killed her," the voice said, after the truce failed. "After everything that happened, we thought you eliminated the witness." "Who?" Eldrick's voice was barely a whisper. "The Calhoun girl. Isabella. The oath child you gave to the Teresi family in 1984. Silence. "You abandoned the oath, Eldrick. You broke your word. We assumed you cleaned up the evidence, made sure no witness survived to speak against you. But she's alive. Apparently." The voice carried a weight Eldrick recognized. The weight of oaths remembered, of promises that outlived the men who made them. And if she spoke the response tonight, then someone taught her. Someone kept the tradition alive. Someone made sure she'd be exactly where you were when the time came. Who? The Teresi family died out in 2003. But they had cousins. Loyalists. People who believed honor mattered more than life. A pause. People who kept promises even after you broke yours. The line went dead. Eldrick sat in the dark of his suite, staring at nothing. The child he'd abandoned 40 years ago. The witness he'd assumed was dead. The evidence of his broken oath that he'd convinced himself was buried beyond resurrection was alive. Working as a waitress in the same city where he'd come to negotiate his retirement. Speaking words that proved she'd been trained, positioned, prepared. Someone with serious resources had invested in hiding her until exactly the right moment. And that moment had been tonight, when he'd spoken of honoring the dead, and she'd reminded him that sons who forget their father's oaths carry the weight of betrayals. Not a threat. A reminder that some promises don't die when you bury them. They just wait, patient as stone, until the day they rise up and demand the debt be paid. Chapter 4. 3 days passed in a kind of suspended animation. Briar called in sick to Maison Corbeau, the first time in 2 years she'd missed a shift. She spent the time in her shotgun apartment, sitting on her bed, touching the silver ring that hung around her neck, trying to remember a childhood that official records claimed had been spent in Louisiana foster homes, but that her fragmentary memories insisted had happened somewhere else entirely. White-haired man, olive wood cane, a woman's voice. Remember the words, Isabella. Isabella. The name echoed in her mind like a stone dropped down a well, waiting for the sound of it hitting bottom. On the morning of the 4th day, Lyndon Crow appeared at her door. He didn't knock aggressively, just 3 measured taps. Patient and inexorable as a debt collector who knew you couldn't run forever. "Miss Calhoun," he said when she opened the door. "Mr. Vale would like to speak with you. He's requested a private meeting." Briar's throat went dry. I didn't mean to." "I know." Lyndon's expression was professionally neutral, but something in his eyes wasn't unkind. "You're not in danger. You have my word on that. But there are things you need to hear. Things that will help you understand what happened on that terrace." She looked at him for a long moment, weighing her options. She could refuse, close the door, disappear the way she'd learned to disappear. New city, new name, new life built on cash payments and falsified references. But some part of her, the part that remembered white hair and olive wood and ceremonial phrases in a language she shouldn't know, needed answers more than it needed safety. "Okay," she whispered. The Garden District mansion Eldrick had rented for his stay in New Orleans was the kind of place that made Briar feel like she was trespassing just by walking through the front gate. White columns, wrap-around porches, live oaks dripping Spanish moss across a courtyard, where a fountain trickled water over weathered stone. Lyndon led her through French doors into a sitting room that smelled of old books and cigar smoke. Rowan stood by the windows overlooking the courtyard, his posture rigid, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't turn when she entered, just kept staring out at the banana trees swaying in the humid breeze. Eldrick sat in a wingback chair that looked like it had been in someone's family for generations. He looked older than he had at the restaurant, smaller, somehow, as if the intervening days had compressed him. His olive wood cane rested against the chair arm. His hands, spotted with age, trembled slightly as they gripped the armrests. "Sit, child," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Briar sat, perched on the edge, ready to bolt if this turned out to be something other than what Lyndon had promised. For a long moment Eldrick just looked at her, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away but somehow couldn't. 40 years ago, he began, his voice carrying the weight of confession. There was a truce negotiation. He paused, took a breath that seemed to hurt. Between my family, the Vales, and another family, the Teresi clan, from Caltanissetta, in Sicily. We had been at war for 15 years. Too much blood on both sides. Too many funerals. Too many mothers weeping over sons who died for grudges none of them could even remember the origins of. Briar's hands tightened in her lap. The Teresi Don wanted peace. His eldest son had been killed in an ambush. My younger brother had been shot outside a cafe in Palermo. We were both tired, both ready to bury the dead and move forward. Eldrick's eyes grew distant, seeing something 40 years past. So we met in neutral ground, a monastery outside the city, and we swore a blood oath. Old style. The kind our grandfathers would have recognized. We would cease all hostilities. We would honor each other's territories. We would bury our dead with dignity, and ensure our children didn't inherit our wars. He paused, and his voice grew quieter. But oaths require witnesses, require insurance. So we agreed to an exchange. Each of us would place a child, not our own, but a child from a loyal family, into the other Don's temporary care. For 1 year, the children would be raised by the other family, taught their ways, taught the ceremonial phrases of the oath, become living witnesses to the promise. Briar's heart was hammering now. The Teresi Don gave me a boy, 7 years old, son of his consigliere. Smart kid, serious. Eldrick's hands gripped the chair arms harder. I gave him a girl. 5 years old, daughter of my most loyal lieutenant. Her father was American, her mother Sicilian. She spoke both languages. His voice cracked. She was perfect. Rowan shifted by the window, but didn't turn around. Her name, Eldrick continued, was Isabella Calhoun. The name fell between them like a stone into still water. She was raised for 1 year in Caltanissetta, taught the oath phrases, taught discipline, taught silence, how to move through rooms without being seen, how to remember things without writing them down, how to carry words that would outlive the men who spoke them. Briar's hands were shaking now. She pressed them against her knees to make them stop. Then the truce failed. Eldrick's voice turned bitter. The Teresi Don's nephew, young, stupid, angry about his cousin's death, killed one of my men in Palermo, killed him in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, as an insult. A way of saying the truce meant nothing. I retaliated. The war resumed. And in the chaos, in the violence that followed, he closed his eyes. I abandoned the oath. I never sent for the girl. I convinced myself the Teresi family would kill her in revenge, that she was already dead, that the oath had died with her. He opened his eyes and looked directly at Briar. "You're Isabella Calhoun," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I left you to die." Briar couldn't breathe. The room felt too small, the air too thick. "But you didn't die," Eldrick continued. "Because the Teresi family, they were more honorable than I was. They kept the oath even after I broke it. They put you into the American foster system with falsified records. Erased the year in Sicily, made you disappear completely. Why?" Briar's voice came out strangled. "Why would they keep me alive? Because they honored their word." Eldrick's eyes were wet now. "Because they believed in the old ways more than I did. Because they raised you to be a witness. Not through violence, through words, through the ceremonial response that proves an oath was made and broken." Lyndon spoke from behind Briar, his voice calm and factual. "Someone with federal-level resources created your background. Built you an identity that would survive casual inspection. Kept you alive, but invisible, until exactly the right moment. The moment when I would be in New Orleans," Eldrick said, "negotiating my retirement, speaking the old phrases, giving you the opportunity to respond." Briar stood abruptly, chair scraping against hardwood. "This is insane. I don't remember any of this. I don't remember Sicily or oaths, or being anyone, except Briar Calhoun." Eldrick nodded. "Because they erased it. Consciously, you forgot. But the training remained. The muscle memory. The words waiting to be spoken, when you heard the trigger phrase." Rowan finally turned from the window, his face pale. "My father's entire legacy is built on honor. On keeping his word. On being the man who could be trusted, when contracts meant nothing." His voice was tight. "And it's all built on a lie. On an oath he broke 40 years ago." "I'm sorry," Eldrick said, looking at Briar. "I'm sorry I abandoned you. I'm sorry I convinced myself you were dead because it was easier than admitting I'd broken my word. I'm sorry you spent your childhood in foster care because I chose power over promise." Briar pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting tears she didn't fully understand. "The Teresi family kept the oath," Eldrick repeated, his voice breaking. "They were more honorable than I ever was. They kept you alive. They kept the tradition alive. They made sure you would be positioned exactly where I would be, exactly when I would speak of honoring the dead." He leaned forward, looking directly into her eyes. "Because, Isabella, Briar, whoever you choose to be, you are living proof that some promises don't die when you bury them. They just wait, patient as stone, until the day they rise up and demand the debt be paid." The fountain in the courtyard trickled on, indifferent to confessions. And Briar Calhoun, Isabella Calhoun, whoever she was, stood in a Garden District mansion, and understood that her entire life had been built around a purpose she'd never known she was carrying. A blood oath, 40 years old, waiting for her to speak 5 words that would remind a powerful man that honor still mattered, even when he'd tried to forget. Chapter 5. Briar left the Garden District mansion in a daze, Lyndon's card in her pocket with a phone number written on the back in neat block letters. "If you need anything," he'd said, "or if you just need to talk to someone who understands what it's like to discover your life isn't what you thought it was." She walked through the French Quarter without seeing it, past tourists laughing on balconies, past street musicians playing for dollar bills, past the scent of beignets and coffee and the river. Her feet carried her on autopilot, while her mind tried to process the impossible. She wasn't Briar Calhoun, random foster kid who'd aged out of the system and built a quiet life through invisible competence. She was Isabella Calhoun, oath child, living witness to a promise made 4 decades ago in a Sicilian monastery. Abandoned when the truce failed. Kept alive by people more honorable than the man who'd left her to die. Trained for 1 year, age 5 to 6, in discipline, language, ceremonial phrases. Then memory erased consciously, professionally, by someone with resources that went beyond simple mafia operations. Federal level, Lyndon had said. Intelligence level, but the muscle memory remained. The training that lived in her hands, in the way she moved through rooms, in the words that had waited 20 years to be spoken when she heard the trigger phrase. Men who don't honor the dead don't deserve to be remembered. And her response, automatic as breathing. And the sons who forget the father's oaths carry the weight of betrayals. She sat on a bench in Jackson Square, staring at the St. Louis Cathedral without seeing it, touching the silver ring on the chain around her neck. Her mother's ring, Rosa Calhoun, née Benedetti, a woman she didn't remember but whose wedding band she'd carried her entire life without knowing why it felt important. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Can we meet tomorrow? Same place. There are things I need to show you. -EV. Eldrick Vale." Offering answers. Offering the truth about who she'd been before she became nobody. But there would be a price. There was always a price. The next morning, back in the Garden District mansion sitting room, Eldrick looked even older. Sleep-deprived, maybe. Or just weighed down by 40 years of carrying a lie. "I need to be clear about something," he said without preamble. "What happens next is your choice. But you need to understand the stakes." Briar sat in the same wingback chair, her posture defensive. "If you speak publicly, if you tell the old families I broke the Caltanissetta oath, my name becomes ash." His voice was steady, but his hands trembled. "Everything I've built over 4 decades, every alliance, every relationship, based on the understanding that Eldrick Vale keeps his word, it collapses." He looked at Rowan, who stood by the French doors again, his face unreadable. "And Rowan's inheritance becomes worthless. Not the money's secure. But the legitimacy. The respect. The ability to negotiate with families who still believe honor matters. All of that dies the moment they learn I abandoned an oath child and lied about it for 40 years. Briar's jaw tightened. "So here's what I'm offering." Eldrick pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. "Compensation, money, property. Enough that you'd never have to work another day in your life. You take it. You stay silent. You live whatever life you want to live. Away from all of this. Away from the past." He placed the envelope on the table between them. "Or," he continued, "you speak. You tell the old families the truth. You destroy me. Destroy what I've built. Exercise the power you've been carrying your whole life, without knowing it." Briar stared at the envelope, at the promise of escape, of security, of a life where she could finally stop being invisible, because she'd have enough money to build walls high enough that invisibility wouldn't matter anymore. Her hand moved to the silver ring on the chain around her neck, turned it slowly between her fingers. "I don't want your money," she said quietly. Eldrick went very still. "I don't want revenge. I don't want to destroy you or your son or your legacy." She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "I just want to know who I was, who my mother was, what the oath actually said, what I was supposed to be before someone decided I needed to forget." She stood, leaving the envelope untouched on the table. "You can keep your money, Mr. Vale. But if you want my silence, you give me the truth. All of it. Everything you know about Isabella Calhoun, about Rosa Benedetti, about that year in Sicily. Every detail. Every memory. Every piece of the life that was taken from me." Eldrick stared at her, for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I can give you that." While Briar was negotiating truth for silence, Rowan Vale was on a plane to New York. He'd made calls, used contacts, found a specialist who worked in the gray spaces between legitimate investigation and the kind of information gathering that didn't ask permission. The specialist operated out of a nondescript office in Midtown, the kind of place that could be a tax preparation service or a private detective agency, depending on who was asking. Social Security number issued at age 7, Rowan said, sliding Breyer's information across the desk. Foster care records that are almost too perfect. Employment history that moves every 18 months like clockwork. What am I looking at? The specialist, a woman in her 50s with gray streaked hair and the kind of tired eyes that came from seeing too much, studied the documents for 20 minutes in silence. Finally, she looked up. Whoever did this had federal resources, maybe international. This isn't mafia quality identity fabrication. This is intelligence level work. Witness protection, maybe, but modified. Or foreign service placement protocols. Something where the goal was to create a functional legal identity that would survive background checks, but leave no trail back to the original person. How much would something like this cost? Money's not the issue. You can't buy this level of work. You need connections, access to databases, people inside agencies who can backdate records, create paper trails that integrate seamlessly with existing systems. She tapped the Social Security number. This was issued through proper channels but years after birth. Someone with authority made that happen, made it look legitimate. Why? To hide someone in plain sight, make them disappear from one life and reappear in another without anyone noticing the gap. Usually it's for protection. Sometimes it's for positioning. Positioning for what? The specialist leaned back. That depends on who did the hiding and what they needed the person to be ready for. Rowan flew back to New Orleans that same night. In Lyndon Crow's assessment, delivered in a private conversation with Rowan in the hotel bar at midnight, the situation was clear. She's the final move in a game that started 40 years ago. Rowan swirled bourbon in his glass. The Teresi Don died in 2003. Who's been running the place since then? Loyalists, cousins, people who believed honor mattered more than revenge. Lyndon's expression was thoughtful. Your father broke an oath. They could have killed the witness child, killed Isabella, and called it even. Instead, they invested resources in keeping her alive, hiding her, training her unconsciously through muscle memory, positioning her in New Orleans at exactly the right time. That's 20 years of investment, 20 years of patience, which tells you how seriously they took the oath, how seriously they take the idea that your father's word meant something, and breaking it required consequences. Rowan stared into his bourbon. What do we do? That depends on what she chooses. If she wants revenge, she speaks publicly, and your father's legacy burns. If she wants money, she takes the envelope and disappears. But if she wants what she actually said she wants, the truth, then we give it to her. Because the truth might be the only thing that satisfies an oath that's been waiting 40 years to be acknowledged. Lyndon finished his drink. She's not a threat, Rowan. She's a mirror, showing your father exactly who he was when he thought no one was watching. And now he has to decide if he's brave enough to look. The next morning, Breyer received a text from Eldrick. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., same place. Bring nothing. I'm bringing everything. She sat on her narrow bed in the shotgun apartment, touching her mother's ring, and realized she was about to learn who Isabella Calhoun had been. Before someone decided that Breyer Calhoun was safer. Before the oath was buried. Before the words waited in silence for 20 years to be spoken. And she understood with sudden clarity that wanting the truth was more dangerous than wanting revenge. Because revenge was simple. Truth demanded you become someone you'd never known you were. Chapter 6. The box sat on the table between them like a coffin for a life that had been buried alive. Eldrick's hands trembled as he opened it. Not from age, Breyer thought, but from the weight of carrying something hidden for 40 years and finally setting it down. The morning light through the French doors caught dust motes floating in the air, making the moment feel suspended in amber. Your mother, Eldrick began, his voice steady despite the trembling hands, was Rosa Calhoun, née Benedetti. He pulled out a photograph, black and white, edges worn from handling. A woman in her late 20s, dark hair pulled back, looking directly at the camera with steel-gray eyes that Breyer recognized because she saw them every morning in the mirror. American father, Sicilian mother, my lieutenant's daughter, raised between two worlds, Brooklyn and Palermo, English and Italian, New World pragmatism and Old World tradition. Eldrick's finger traced the edge of the photo. She was the best of both, sharp, loyal, fierce, when she needed to be. Your father, Thomas Calhoun, was a good man, honest. He worked the docks, handled logistics, never wanted to be in the life, but loved Rosa enough to accept what her family was. Breyer took the photograph with shaking hands. The woman looking back at her had the same sharp cheekbones, the same severe elegance that Breyer had always thought made her look unfriendly. But in the photo, Rosa was smiling, just slightly, like someone who didn't waste smiles but meant them when they came. They died in a car accident, Eldrick continued, pulling out more photographs. "You were 4. Rosa's family, the Benedettis, took you in, raised you for a year, and when the oath was made, when we needed a witness child." He stopped, gathered himself. "You were perfect. 5 years old, bilingual, smart, already disciplined in ways most children weren't. Rosa's family offered you for the exchange because they trusted me, because they believed I would honor the oath and bring you back when the year was finished." More photographs. A small girl with ash blonde hair standing between 2 older men in what looked like a Sicilian courtyard. The girl's posture was already precise, already trained, already learning to be invisible while seeing everything. "This is you," Eldrick said. "In Caltanissetta, with the Teresi family." Briar stared at the child who was supposedly her, but the face was a stranger's. No memory, no recognition, just a photograph of someone she should have been, but wasn't allowed to become. Eldrick pulled out letters, yellowed paper, careful handwriting in Italian. "Rosa wrote these during the year you were in Sicily. The Teresi Don allowed it. Monthly letters describing how you were doing. He wanted her to know you were safe, well cared for, honored as the sacred witness you'd become." He handed the first letter to Briar. She couldn't read Italian well enough to parse the handwriting, but Eldrick translated, his voice thick. "My darling Isabella is thriving. The Teresi family writes that she learns faster than any child they've known. She speaks the ceremonial phrases perfectly now. She moves through their home like a little ghost, silent, watchful, missing nothing. She's brave, so brave. I miss her every moment, but I'm proud of her. She's doing what our family has always done, keeping promises, honoring oaths, being the witness that ensures peace." Briar's vision blurred. Another letter, dated 3 months later. "They say she asks about me sometimes, asks when she's coming home. It breaks my heart. But the Don himself told me she stopped crying at night. She's accepted her purpose. She's becoming what we needed her to be, the perfect witness. The child who will ensure that honor means something. She was so proud of you," Eldrick whispered. "So proud that you were strong enough to carry an oath at 5 years old." He reached into the box again, pulled out the last item. A silver ring, delicate, worn smooth with wear. "Rosa's wedding band," he said. "Thomas gave it to her when they married. She wore it every day until she died. When you went to Sicily, the Benedetti family put it on a chain around your neck. Told you it was your mother's. Told you to never take it off, to remember where you came from." Briar's hand went to her neck automatically, touching the ring she'd worn for 20 years without knowing why it mattered. The same ring. The only physical connection to a mother she didn't remember. "After the truce failed," Eldrick continued, his voice breaking now. "After the war resumed, I never sent for you. I told myself the Teresi family had killed you in revenge. It was easier than admitting I'd broken my word. Easier than facing Rosa's family and telling them I'd abandoned the child they'd trusted me with." He looked directly at Briar, tears running down his weathered face. "Rosa died believing you'd been killed. She spent her last 2 years grieving you. I let her believe that. I let your family believe that, because admitting the truth meant admitting I'd abandoned you, meant admitting I'd broken the oath, meant destroying the reputation I'd spent decades building." "Why are you telling me this now?" Briar asked through her own tears, clutching her mother's photograph like a lifeline. Eldrick glanced at Rowan, who stood by the French doors with his jaw tight, watching his father dismantle his own legacy in real time. "Because my son is right," Eldrick said. "If we're not honorable, we're just criminals in expensive suits. I've spent 40 years pretending I was a man of honor while hiding the proof that I wasn't. I broke the oath. I abandoned you. I built my entire reputation on a lie." He stood, leaning heavily on his olive wood cane. "It's time to stop lying." Rowan's voice came from the window, quiet but firm. "Papa, if you do this, if you tell the old families." "I know what it means." Eldrick's voice was steady now, the trembling gone. "My reputation will be diminished. Your inheritance will be affected. The respect I've cultivated for 4 decades will turn to something else. Pity, maybe, or contempt for a man who hid his dishonor behind false honor." "So why?" Briar whispered. "Why tell the truth now?" Eldrick looked at the box of photographs, letters, memories of a child he'd left to die, and a woman who'd died grieving her. "Because truth outlasts reputation," he said simply. "Because I'm tired of carrying the lie. Because you deserve to know who your mother was, who you were supposed to be, what the oath actually meant." He turned to face Briar fully. "I'll tell the old families I broke the Caltanissetta oath. I'll acknowledge that I abandoned the witness child. I'll accept whatever consequences come from that truth. Not because you're forcing me to. Because it's time I became the man I've pretended to be for 40 years. Rowan stepped forward. "You realize this changes everything." "I do. The retirement negotiations. The transition. Everything we've planned. I know. And you're choosing this anyway. Eldrick looked at his son, and something like peace settled over his weathered features. I'm choosing to be honorable for once. Even if it's 40 years too late. He turned back to Briar. The box is yours. Everything in it. Your mother's letters. Your photographs from Sicily. The ring you've been wearing without knowing why. The truth about Isabella Calhoun. And what she was supposed to become before I destroyed that future. Briar pulled the box toward her, hands shaking, tears streaming down her face as she looked at photographs of a mother she'd never known, and a childhood that had been stolen to protect a lie. Thank you, she whispered. And Eldrick Vale, the Wolf of Palermo, the man who'd built an empire on the belief that his word meant something, nodded once and understood that this was the first truly honorable thing he'd done in 40 years. It was also the thing that would cost him everything he'd built on dishonor. But for the first time since 1984, when he'd abandoned a 5-year-old girl in Sicily and convinced himself she'd died, he felt like he could finally breathe without the weight of that lie pressing against his chest. Truth outlasted reputation. And honor, real honor, required you to face the consequences of your dishonor. Even when those consequences arrived, in the form of a quiet waitress who'd been carrying your broken promise for 20 years without knowing it. Chapter 7. 6 months can rebuild a life or reveal what was always there, hidden beneath the weight of someone else's vengeance. Briar Calhoun no longer wore the black uniform of Maison Corbeau. She no longer moved through dining rooms like a ghost, pouring wine for men who spoke in code and left blood under their fingernails. Instead, she stood in the New Orleans French Quarter Museum of Immigration, her fingers tracing the edge of a glass display case containing passenger manifests from 1952. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years being invisible in rooms full of wolves, and now she worked in a place dedicated to making the invisible visible again. The exhibit she curated told the stories of families fractured by ocean crossings and false promises, of women who arrived with one name and died with another, of children who learned to forget their mother tongue to survive. Her mother's story wasn't there, not officially, but Briar felt Caterina Teresi in every yellowed document, every faded photograph, every handwritten note that said, "I am here, I existed, I mattered." The letter had arrived 3 weeks after the night at Maison Corbeau, postmarked from a village outside Palermo she'd never heard of. The handwriting was elderly but steady, the Italian formal and careful. "Cara Briar, we are your mother's cousins. The Teresi family has been searching for you since the night Caterina disappeared. We knew she went to America. We knew she loved a man who promised her safety. We did not know she died protecting a secret that was never hers to carry." There were 17 cousins. Some had children. Some had grandchildren. They sent photographs. A woman with Briar's narrow shoulders, a man with her dark eyes, a child with the same stubborn set to the jaw. They sent recipes written in Caterina's hand. They sent stories about a girl who sang while she worked and dreamed of becoming a teacher, not a weapon someone else's vendetta required. They had kept the oath alive, those cousins, not because they believed in Eldrick Beaumont's war or Victor Orlov's empire, but because Caterina had asked them to remember, and in Sicily, memory was a form of love. Briar kept the name Calhoun. It felt important to acknowledge both identities, the woman her mother had tried to protect, and the woman she was choosing to become. But the silver ring no longer hid against her collarbone on a chain. It sat openly on her right hand now, the Teresi family crest worn smooth by generations of women who had refused to disappear. She heard Eldrick had retired. Not in disgrace. The old families of New Orleans were too calculating for public scandal, but with a reputation quietly diminished, like a painting left too long in harsh light. The whispers said he'd confessed everything to the remaining heads of the founding bloodlines. Not just about Caterina Teresi and the fabricated vendetta, but about every compromise he'd made in 60 years of ruling through fear disguised as tradition. The old families, surprisingly, respected the confession more than they would have respected the lie's continuation. The wolf admitted he broke his word. She'd overheard at a gallery opening last month. "That takes courage. We thought his generation had forgotten." Eldrick reached out once, through Rowan. Not an apology. Men like that didn't apologize, not really, but an invitation to coffee. She'd gone. They'd sat in silence for the first 10 minutes, two people bound by a promise neither of them had made but both had paid for. He looked older. The silver in his hair had turned white. The lines around his eyes cut deeper. "Your mother," he said finally, "sang when she worked in the kitchen. I'd forgotten that until recently. She had a voice that made you stop whatever you were doing just to listen." Briar had stared at him. That single detail, that small human detail, was worth more than any apology he could construct. She'd nodded. They drank their coffee. She left. They saw each other occasionally after that, not as family, not as co-conspirators in the unraveling of a decades-old lie. Just two people who understood that history was heavier than hatred, and that sometimes survival meant learning to carry weight without letting it crush you. Rowan had transformed too. He'd taken control of the Beaumont shipping interests, and begun the slow, meticulous work of making them legitimate. Real manifests, real cargo, real taxes paid to real governments. It was boring work, he'd told her over lunch last week, but boring was proving more profitable than the old ways ever were. Turns out, he'd said, stirring his coffee with the same precise movements he used for everything, people respect you more when you build something honest than when you inherit something bloody. He understood now what Briar had tried to tell him that night in the kitchen. Some promises outlive the men who made them. And that's how it should be, not as chains binding the innocent to ancient wars, but as reminders that words have consequences that ripple forward through generations, touching lives that were never part of the original equation. The afternoon sun slanted through the museum's tall windows, turning the dust motes into constellations. Behind Briar, a group of tourists clustered around the Ellis Island exhibit, their voices rising and falling in animated Italian. She understood every word now, not just the language her mother had whispered to her as a child, but the context, the idioms, the jokes that only made sense if you knew where the words came from. She smiled, because she wasn't the weapon someone else had forged in the fires of a vendetta that should have died with Viktor Orlov. She wasn't the ghost her mother had tried to create by erasing her own history. She wasn't even the frightened girl who'd served wine to wolves and hoped invisibility would keep her safe. She was Briar Calhoun, daughter of Katerina Teresi, curator of forgotten stories, keeper of promises that had outlived their purpose, a woman who had chosen truth over revenge, knowledge over power, identity over invisibility, and that choice, that refusal to let someone else's ancient war define her, was more dangerous than any oath sworn in blood over a dead man's memory. Outside, the New Orleans afternoon pressed thick and golden against the museum windows. Inside, Briar turned back to her work, cataloging the lives of women who'd crossed oceans with nothing but names they'd fight to keep. Just like her mother. Just like her. The inheritance wasn't vengeance. It was this. The stubborn insistence on being remembered exactly as you were, not as someone else needed you to be. Chapter 8. 1 year later, Briar Calhoun stood in the courtyard of a monastery outside Caltanissetta, Sicily, where her mother had been born, and where an oath had been sworn over bodies that would never grow old. The stone beneath her feet was worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, and the air smelled of lemon trees and something older. Incense, maybe, or just the weight of accumulated prayers. Her cousin Juliana stood beside her, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing black as though mourning was a permanent state, rather than a temporary condition. 17 Teresi cousins had welcomed Briar home, because that's what they called it. Home, even though Briar had left when she was too young to remember the shape of these hills, or the particular quality of Sicilian sunlight that turned everything golden and ancient at once. This is where they made the promise, Juliana said, gesturing toward a small chapel attached to the monastery. Your grandfather, Eldrick Beaumont. The witnesses, 1985. 3 families had lost men in the war Viktor Orlov started. The Beaumonts, the Teresis, the Marchettis. Your mother was chosen because she was young, beautiful, educated, because her presence in New Orleans would prove the Teresis trusted Eldrick's word. They walked through the chapel doors. Inside, the air was cool and still. A simple wooden table stood in the center of the room, scarred and dark with age. Briar could imagine them here, her grandfather, rigid with grief and pride. Eldrick Beaumont, younger then, still believing he could control the future through carefully worded contracts. Her mother, barely 18, holding a suitcase and a promise she didn't fully understand. What did the oath actually say? Briar asked, her voice echoing slightly off the stone walls. Juliana pulled a folded paper from her jacket, not the original, but a copy, carefully preserved. She handed it to Briar. The words were in Italian and English, parallel columns of formal language that felt heavy, even on the page. We swear before God and the honored dead, that the war between our families ends with us. The children born after this day will carry no weapons, no vendettas, no blood debts from the past. They will be living proof that old hatreds can die, that peace is possible, that family can mean something other than war. Briar read it twice, then a third time. The words rearranged themselves in her mind, shifting from what she'd believed they meant to what they actually said. I wasn't a hostage, she said slowly. No, Juliana's voice was gentle. You were hope, Your presence in New Orleans meant more than any contract, because you were both families' future. You were proof the oath worked, that Tauruses and Beaumonts could coexist, that the next generation didn't have to carry what the last one had broken. Briar pressed her fingers to the wooden table. She thought about her mother, young and terrified, arriving in a city that must have felt like exile. She thought about Eldrick Beaumont, watching a promise he'd made become a person who served him wine, and never knew she was supposed to mean something more. She thought about her own hands pouring water for men who spoke in code, her own invisibility that had felt like survival but was actually forgetting. She understood now. The oath hadn't been about controlling her. It had been about freeing her, and everyone who came after, from the wars that had consumed their parents. Eldrick had broken it not by lying about who she was, but by making her invisible. By letting her become a ghost, instead of the living bridge between past and future that the oath had intended. When Briar returned to New Orleans 3 weeks later, she requested a meeting with Eldrick and Rowan. They met at a neutral location, a coffee shop in the Garden District where tourists wandered past oblivious, and the chicory was strong enough to make your hand shake. Eldrick looked older every time she saw him. Rowan looked tired. Both of them carried the weight of rebuilding a legacy they discovered was constructed on convenient lies. I went to Sicily, Briar said without preamble. I saw the monastery. They showed me what the oath actually said. Eldrick's hands tightened around his cup. I won't speak publicly about the broken oath, Briar continued. But I won't lie about who I am either. I'm Isabella Calhoun. And I'm Briar. Both. I'm the daughter of Caterina Turrisi, and I'm the woman who served you for 3 years before either of us knew what that meant. She leaned forward. The oath didn't die. It just waited for someone to remember why it mattered. Eldrick nodded slowly. Something in his face shifted. Not quite relief, but perhaps the first breath after holding pain too long. Rowan asked the question she'd been expecting. What now? Briar smiled. It felt strange on her face, this expression that wasn't fear or careful neutrality, but something close to contentment. Now I live the life I was supposed to have. The one where I'm not invisible anymore. Where I'm not a weapon or a secret or a ghost. Just myself. 3 months later, she walked past Maison Corbeau's terrace at sunset, the place where she'd once poured water and listened to dangerous men discuss territory and blood. A new server moved between tables with the same careful anonymity Briar had perfected. But Briar was a guest now, not staff. She wore a dress, the color of Sicilian lemons, and the Turrisi ring openly on her finger. Eldrick and Rowan sat at a corner table, discussing shipping manifests and quarterly projections, legitimate business conducted in full daylight. When Briar approached, Eldrick rose slightly, an old courtesy from an older world. He raised his glass. To oaths kept, he said quietly. Even when broken, Briar lifted her own glass, the wine catching the golden light. To the dead who taught us to remember. Nobody else in the dining room knew the significance of the toast. The tourists and business executives and couples celebrating anniversaries just heard 2 sentences that sounded vaguely profound. But near the exit, Lyndon Crow, still watching, always watching, smiled slightly. Because he understood what most people never would. The most dangerous power is held by those who don't want it but know exactly when to use it. The servers who hear everything. The daughters who remember what they were told to forget. The women who choose truth over revenge and knowledge over violence. Briar Calhoun had inherited an oath meant to end a war. She'd survived its breaking. And she'd done something more dangerous than either. She'd remembered why it mattered in the first place. Outside, the New Orleans evening pressed warm and thick against the restaurant's windows. Inside, 3 people who'd been bound by lies drank wine and spoke of futures instead of pasts, of promises instead of vendettas, of remembering instead of forgetting. The oath lived on, not in blood or secrecy, or invisible girls serving wolves, but in the simple radical act of being exactly who you were, loudly enough that no one could ever make you disappear again. The server cleared their table as the sun disappeared behind the old buildings of the French Quarter, and Briar watched the light fade into that particular shade of purple that only exists in New Orleans at dusk. She thought about all the women who'd come before her, her mother, her grandmother, the countless others who'd learned to make themselves small to survive in rooms where men decided what names they could keep and what histories they had to forget. She thought about the oaths sworn in a Sicilian monastery, meant to prove that peace was possible, that the next generation didn't have to inherit the wars of the last, and she thought about how close she'd come to being just another ghost story. Another footnote in someone else's vendetta. Another invisible woman pouring wine while the world happened around her. But she wasn't invisible anymore. Because the most powerful thing you can do in a world designed to make you disappear is to stand up and say, I am here. I existed. I matter. To speak the language they told you to forget. To wear the name they told you to hide. To remember what they wanted buried. Briar Calhoun, Isabella Teresi, had done all of that. Not with violence, not with revenge, but with the quiet, devastating power of simply refusing to be erased. And that's the kind of story that doesn't end. It echoes. It spreads. It finds the people who need to hear it most. The ones who've been told to stay quiet, stay small, stay grateful for the scraps of identity they're allowed to keep. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who think they're more important than you, then I need you to do something right now. Hit that like button. Show me that Briar's story mattered to you, that you understand the power of refusing to disappear. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to hide part of your identity to survive? What language, what name, what truth did you have to keep silent? Share your story. This community sees you. We remember you. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. The woman working 3 jobs who everyone overlooks. The immigrant whose accent makes people dismiss their intelligence. The person who's been told their history doesn't matter. Send them this story. Tell them, you are not invisible. You never were. And subscribe. Hit that notification bell. Because next week, I'm bringing you another story about the kind of power the world doesn't advertise. The power of the overlooked. The underestimated. The ones who were supposed to disappear, but chose to be remembered instead. Because here's the truth they don't want you to know. The most dangerous person in any room isn't the one with the biggest title or the loudest voice. It's the one who's been paying attention. The one who remembers. The one who knows exactly when to stop being invisible. Briar proved that. And so can you. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Let's build a community of people who refuse to be erased. See you next week. And remember, some promises outlive the men who made them. And that's exactly how it should be.